On the morning of February 24, 2026, President Donald Trump fundamentally altered the course of North American relations by issuing an aggressive trade ultimatum against Canada via a social media post on Truth Social. This was not a standard diplomatic warning or a subtle signal for negotiation. It was a blunt 14-day demand for total submission. In his post, the president declared that unless Canada immediately agreed to a series of strictly maximalist conditions, it would face a 35% tariff on all goods entering the United States. This move caught official Washington completely off guard, as it bypassed all established diplomatic channels, ignored formal consultations with Congress, and circumvented the standard oversight of the United States Trade Representative. By choosing such a public and abrasive platform, the administration signaled that these demands were not intended for debate, but were instead a forced choice between economic compliance or severe financial consequences. The conditions attached to this ultimatum were described by insiders as deliberately designed to humiliate Ottawa and force a reordering of the bilateral relationship in favor of American interests. Rather than seeking a collaborative solution to shared economic challenges, the administration's strategy focused on leveraging the immense dependence of the Canadian economy on U.S. markets. This aggressive stance effectively weaponized trade policy, shifting it away from the negotiated framework of the USMCA and into a realm of unilateral economic coercion. It represented a departure from decades of established practice, treating a long-standing treaty partner not as a sovereign ally, but as a subordinate entity that was expected to yield to executive pressure without hesitation or legal pushback. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney, bringing his extensive high-level experience in managing the Bank of England and navigating international financial crises, immediately recognized the gravity of the situation. He understood that this was not merely a dispute over specific trade items like steel or lumber. It was an existential challenge to Canadian sovereignty. Rejecting the ultimatum entirely, Carney signaled that Canada would refuse to be treated as a client state. By taking this defiant stance, he demonstrated that Canada was fully prepared to move beyond diplomatic platitudes and engage in a comprehensive, pre-planned economic defense. His refusal to flinch at the threat of economic annihilation marked a critical turning point, drawing a firm line against the administration's attempt to use intimidation as a tool of foreign policy, and triggering a series of retaliatory measures that the White House had clearly failed to anticipate. The roots of the current crisis extend back to December 2025, a period defined by escalating tensions between Washington and Ottawa. During these months, the Trump administration repeatedly applied intense pressure on Canadian leadership, often questioning Canada's sovereign independence and suggesting that the nation should consider a status closer to an American state. While Canadian officials initially hoped these remarks were merely hyperbolic rhetoric, the situation deteriorated rapidly as the administration began to demand that Canadian diplomats stop publicly rejecting the idea. By mid-January 2026, the diplomatic channels had essentially broken down, as it became clear the U.S. administration was not engaging in a typical policy disagreement, but was actively seeking to challenge Canada's standing as a sovereign, autonomous nation. The situation reached a breaking point on February 17, 2026, following a leaked-off-the-record briefing from a senior White House economic advisor. This briefing stripped away any doubt regarding the administration's intentions, revealing a cold, calculated strategy of economic punishment designed to force Canada into total submission. The summary of this briefing, which circulated through the Canadian parliamentary staff within 48 hours, made it clear that the U.S. was no longer focused on trade deficits or typical economic negotiations. Instead, it was using trade policy as a tool of political coercion. Recognizing that this was a direct assault on the nation's integrity, Prime Minister Mark Carney and his cabinet immediately convened a high-level war game session in the basement of the Langevin block, adjacent to the House of Commons. Joined by the Minister of Finance, the Governor of the Bank of Canada, and expert trade advisors, the government activated a contingency plan that had been quietly developed over several weeks of mounting pressure. When the president finally issued the official ultimatum on the morning of February 24, 2026, the Canadian response was not a scramble, but an immediate, decisive countermove. Within hours, Canada executed a three-pronged strategy designed to demonstrate that the nation would not be intimidated. First, the government initiated a formal, comprehensive review of all export permits for critical minerals such as cobalt, lithium, and rare earth elements, that are vital to American defense manufacturing and high-tech industries. Second, Canada announced immediate, reciprocal 35% tariffs on a curated list of American consumer goods, specifically targeting products manufactured in states that held significant political influence. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the government formally invoked Chapter 31 of the USMCA. By triggering this legal mechanism, Canada effectively forced the administration into a formal dispute resolution process before an international panel, stripping the president of his ability to bypass the law through social media declarations and moving the conflict into a space governed by treaty rules rather than political pressure. The repercussions of the president's tariff ultimatum were immediate and severe, rippling through the North American economy with alarming speed. Within the first hour of trading after the announcement, American automotive and energy stocks sectors deeply intertwined with Canadian components and energy exports experienced a sharp decline. Investors reacted with panic, anticipating profound disruptions to cross-border supply chains that have been built over decades. The uncertainty paralyzed decision-making for major manufacturers, as companies that rely on a predictable flow of parts and raw materials from Canada suddenly faced the prospect of massive, unexpected cost spikes. This instability reached far beyond the stock market, threatening to slow job growth and increase prices for American consumers who rely on everything from Canadian steel and lumber to imported energy supplies. The legal fallout is arguably even more consequential. Legal experts and international trade analysts have noted that the president's 35% tariff appears to violate the explicit procedural requirements of the USMCA, a trade agreement he signed in 2020, and frequently touted as his greatest achievement. The USMCA includes specific binding rules on how and when a member nation can adjust tariffs, and by bypassing these legal requirements to issue a unilateral, emergency-style mandate, the administration has placed itself in direct conflict with the very framework of the treaty. This is a critical legal challenge because it creates a direct confrontation between domestic executive power and international treaty obligations. When a government unilaterally ignores the rules it formally committed to, it undermines the rule of law that provides the foundation for stable international trade. By invoking Chapter 31 of the USMCA to challenge these tariffs, Canada has moved the dispute into an international forum where U.S. domestic political rhetoric is effectively neutralized. In this dispute resolution mechanism, a panel of experts must objectively assess whether the tariff measures are consistent with the treaty's articles. Because this process operates on established rules rather than executive decree, it provides a venue where Canada's legal arguments can be heard without being overshadowed by the administration's political threats. If the panel rules against the United States, it would establish a formal, binding legal precedent. Such a ruling would not only force the administration to reconsider its policy, but would also restrict the ability of future administrations to use the USMCA as a tool for arbitrary coercion. This case has now become the definitive test of whether the USMCA will function as a predictable, rules-based framework for North American commerce, or if it will be reduced to an instrument of short-term political leverage. Beyond the immediate economic fallout, this conflict represents a fundamental and dangerous test of American treaty integrity. For decades, the United States has relied on stable, rules-based agreements to anchor its economic relationships, with the USMCA serving as the cornerstone of North American trade. By bypassing constitutional oversight and unilaterally discarding the procedural requirements of a treaty the president himself negotiated, the administration has signaled to the global community that American commitments are essentially conditional, subject to change based on the president's personal mood or temporary political whims. This unpredictability is a massive strategic liability, as it forces allies and partners to question whether any agreement signed with Washington will be honored by future administrations. This aggressive shift has sparked profound alarm throughout the American political and economic establishment. On Capitol Hill, members of both the Republican and Democratic parties are expressing deep concern over the administration's legal rationale, fearing that the erosion of treaty norms will leave American businesses and workers vulnerable to retaliatory measures. Defense contractors, who rely on a complex integrated supply chain of critical minerals and components sourced from Canada, are particularly worried. They see these threats not just as economic hurdles, but as direct risks to national security and operational readiness. Meanwhile, the American agricultural sector, which views Canada as a vital and dependable market for grain, livestock, and other exports is warning of the alarming consequences of entering a sustained trade war. As the mandatory 30-day consultation period under the USMCA begins, the administration finds itself trapped in a self-inflicted dilemma with no clear, low-risk path forward. If the White House backs down now by rescinding the tariffs, it risks appearing weak to its core political base, which has been sold on a narrative of aggressive, unilateral economic strength. Conversely, if the administration proceeds with these 35% tariffs, it triggers a long-term, self-defeating economic and legal battle that is almost certain to result in an international panel ruling against the United States. This would not only validate Canada's position, but also set a binding legal precedent that limits the executive branch's future authority. Ultimately, the administration's actions have moved North American relations away from a framework of collaborative, predictable trade and toward a state of constant, high-stakes political coercion, leaving both countries in a period of deep uncertainty.